wish to stop.
It's the 18th century, in Europe is a very contingent point. Conflicts like the War of Spanish Succession, and War of Austrian Succession, were engulfing Europe. We begin in 1740, when the Holy Roman Empire is divided into a multitude of territories ruled by prince-electors. At the very top of the hierarchy is the title of emperor, which has been shared for almost 300 years by the powerful Habsburg house. France backs Prussia while Britain meanwhile, backs Austria, fearing an imbalance of power in favor of the French Empire. After 5 years of war, Prussia abandons its French ally by signing a peace treaty with Austria. Prussia holds on to the territory of Silesia but recognizes Maria Theresa as the Archduchess of Austria. Her husband, Francis of Lorraine, obtains the title of Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. France finds itself alone against the coalition and still manages to seize the Austrian Netherlands. A peace treaty was signed in 1748. But there is more problems. There is a border dispute in North America, between the British and French. Britain and France had carved out their own dominion across the continent, which by the mid-18th century had grown into several prosperous colonies. The British had focused their efforts along the eastern seaboard with the 13 colonies stretching from Georgia in the south, to Maine in the north, as well as the recently acquired Canadian provinces, of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, which has been ceded from France in a previous conflict. The French laid claim to St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and much of the Mississippi River, and basin down towards the Gulf of Mexico. The exact boundaries between the two respective possessions were ill-defined, but the French were determined to prevent any British settlers from encroaching westwards, and so constructed a series of forts predominantly in the Ohio River Valley, to assert their claim over the territory. The most contentious of these fortifications. The British initially tried to resolve what they perceived as an infringement onto their territory through peaceful means. But after their protestations fell on deaf ears, they decided to dispatch a small number of colonial troops alongside native allies to drive the French out by force. The commanding officer of the expedition was a 21-year-old lieutenant colonel in the Virginia Regiment named George Washington, who later on would become one of Britain's enemies. Washington's men marched to Bath, where they subsequently ambushed a small party of French colonial troops in the Battle of Jumonville Glen on the 28th of May, 1754. The French retaliated just over 1 week later, by attacking Washington's men, at Fort Necessity, on the 3rd of July. This would force them to surrender. Although the 7 Years' War would not officially commence for another 2 years, these small skirmishes in the backwoods of North America formed the first engagements of what would become the global conflict. The conflict in North America, today is referred to as the French and Indian War. News spread about fighting in the colonies. Eventually, the British government found that what happened, and they weren't happy one bit. Both nations sent troops to North America in anticipation of the conflict that was coming. The first major British action was the assault on Acadia, on the 16th of June, 1755, which was immediately followed by the expulsion of the French populace across the territory. In July, British Major General Edward Braddock led around 2,000 troops and provincial militia on a mission to retake Fort Buen. But the expedition ended in disastrous defeat at the Battle of the Monongahela, with Braddock himself being mortally wounded. Further engagements saw the British and French meet at the inconclusive Battle of Lake George in September of that year. Meanwhile, the British under Admiral Edward Bozen fired on the French ship Elise on the 8th of June, capturing it and 2 troop transports that were making their way to reinforce the colony in Quebec. The French responded to these provocations on April 17, 1756, by launching an invasion of the British-held island of Minorca. On May 17, Britain declared war. The British tried to send a relief naval force, but were defeated, and so the island was captured. John Byng's failure would lead to his execution by firing squad next year. Tensions between Prussia and Austria over the status of Silesia. The Austrians were determined to retake the territory, while Frederick the Great was determined to keep it, having already secured his much-needed alliance with Britain. Frederick moved preemptively and invaded Saxony in August 1756. Put at this point, Saxony was allied with Austria and France. Frederick's strategy was to march through Saxony, and into Austrian territory in Bohemia. This was before any from Russia would come. However, everything wouldn't go as planned. He would face his first battle in Austria. The Battle of Lobositz on October 1, 1756. An Austrian force to 33,000 men under General Maximilian Ulysses Brown, managed to repel Frederick's advance. As a result, the Prussians would be boxed down for the next year, trying to make a breakthrough in Bohemia. Close at the Ball of Prague in May, but were repelled yet again at the Battle of Kolin. With the Prussian army now concentrated against the Austrians, the French took the opportunity to march into Hanover, and occupied much of King George II's German homeland. The Duke defeated the Hanoverian army, led by the youngest son of the British king, the Duke of Cumberland, at the Battle of Hastenbeck in July. In the end, Hanover was effectively forced to capitulate early in the war by signing the Convention of Clusterseen. Meanwhile, to the east, the Russian forces had mobilized and advanced into East Ria under the command of Field Marshal N. Taking the fortress of Memel, this wave of Prussian defeats forced them to retreat into their own territory, which in turn presented an opportunity for other anti-Russian European states to take advantage of their now weakened position. Sweden subsequently declared war on Prussia on the 22nd of September, and invaded Pomerania with 177,000 men. Towards the end of 1757, Prussia faced massive threats on all fronts. Despite this seemingly inescapable position, however, Frederick the Great managed to pull off a series of perfectly executed maneuvers that brought about a reversal in Prussia's fortunes, which were nothing short of military genius. First, he devastated a combined French-German army at the Battle of Rossbach on November 5, despite being outnumbered almost 2-1. He then turned about and routed a similarly numerically superior Austrian force at the Battle of Leuthen the following month. This further solidifies his reputation as one of Europe's greatest military commanders. Finally, he turned north, driving the Swedes out of Prussian territory, and occupying Swedish Pomerania. In the process, while the initial salvos in the war were being fired in Europe, military developments were also underway in India. The region was still largely ruled by the indigenous powers of the time, with the Mughal Empire in the north, the Sultanate of Myr in the south, and the Maratha Confederacy in the central parts of the subcontinent. The British and French East India Companies had each established their own enclaves throughout the regions, such as at Pondicherry and the Coromandel coast in the case of the French, whereas the British held Madras, Bombay, and Kolkata. The Battle of Plassey, fought in the northeast of India on June 23, 1757, came to be the first notable engagement of the conflict. A small contingent of British East India Company troops, led by a young officer, named Robert Clive, along with several thousand Indian allies, they defeated an army of 50,000, under the command of the local Bengal ruler, S. J. Uda. The Bengalis were aided by a small French detachment, but nevertheless, suffered a cataclysmic defeat at the hands of the British, who subsequently established their control over the wider Bengal region thereafter. Clive and other company officials began expanding aggressively across the rest of the subcontinent. Although the French captured Calais, their siege of Madras failed. Under Sir Eyre Coote, the British decisively defeated the French forces at the Battle of Wonder Washington. Pondicherry would fall in 1761 to the British. Let's head back to the North American front. The French had initially gained the upper hand in the fighting by capturing Fort Oswego in 1756. They then would capture Fort William Henry in 1757. However, the numbers of the British colonists to the French colonists made a big difference. It's an easy explanation: most of New France was actually inhabited by the people who originally were there, the Native Americans. The French were perfectly fine with this, because they only really cared about the fur trade. The colonial population of the 13 colonies, by the late 1750s, was around 2 million people, while that of New France was barely 100,000. Once the initial fours had been launched and the British had mobilized the full support of their colonists, the French stood little chance of emerging victorious. By 1758, the British had secured their western frontier, by capturing Fort Douai, and for Frontenac, and had begun to take the fight to the French colonies in Canada. The fortress of Louisbourg was captured in July of that year, but not before the French had managed to thwart a British overland advance, and they would face off on one of the bloodiest battles in the North American front, the Battle of Carillon. French forces under Louis-Joseph de Montcalm faced a much larger British army led by James Abercrombie. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the French built strong defensive positions using trenches and wooden barriers. The British launched repeated frontal attacks without proper artillery support, which led to heavy losses. The French successfully repelled every assault and won a decisive victory. The battle is remembered as a major example of how strong defenses and leadership can overcome superior numbers. Britain then wanted France to be in a costly war in Europe, by supplying their ally, Prussia. The Royal Navy with a few accompanying army detachments, then deployed to attack French ports in a series of raids, known as descents. Assaults were carried out against the town of Rochefort in 1757, and Cherbourg, in 1758, but they were limited in mixed success. They then decided instead to focus on France's more lucrative, and exposed overseas possessions. The French-controlled sugar-producing colonies in the Caribbean were very valuable for the revenue they made. The two islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique were worth more to the French economically than the whole of New France. In November 1758, 8 ships of the line were dispatched to the Caribbean with the objective of seizing Martinique, but after determining that it was too well defended, they instead sailed on to Guadeloupe in January 1759. Despite tropical disease breaking out and decimating the British troops, the island was eventually captured in spring. It would, however, be another 3 years before Martinique was taken. The war had also expanded to the continent of Africa by this point, after the British sent Phila to capture Fort Louis and the French slave trading stations in what is now Senegal in April 1758. Back in Europe, the British government had managed to persuade King George II to disregard the treaty that had seen Hanover surrender in the previous September, and had it re-enter the war. Britain also dispatched 9,000 troops to reinforce the Hanoverian army, now under the command of Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick. He succeeded in driving the French from the territory by the spring of 1758. In Eastern Europe, the Russians had seized control of East Prussia during the winter, and were now threatening to advance into Prussia's heartland. Further to the west, Frederick the Great mustered an army of 35,000 men to meet the Russians at the Battle of Zorf on August 25. The engagement ultimately proved inconclusive and extremely costly. The Russian army had only 4,000 troops, and so failed to break through the Prussian lines. Things were starting to kind of stale into a stalemate. The British knew that they could never match the strength of the French army on land, and the French knew that they could not match the might of the Royal Navy on the high seas. The French, however, decided to plan an absolutely insane invasion of the UK. It would involve sailing an army across the Channel, and landing on the coast of England. William Pitt did become aware of the detentions of the French plan, and he ordered for the Royal Navy to eliminate any possibility of an invasion. In August of that year, the British scattered the French Mediterranean fleet at the Battle of Lagos. The English would then pull off another victory in November at the Battle of Guan Bay. This finally put the threat of a French invasion to end. The front in North America began to intensify. The British and the French guarded up for a brutal battle for the city of Quebec. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham. British forces, led by James Wolfe, and French forces under Louis-Joseph de Montcalm. The British had been trying for months to capture Quebec, a key stronghold of New France, but French defenses along the St. Lawrence River made a direct attack extremely difficult. To break the stalemate, Wolfe came up with a bold and risky plan. Under cover of darkness, British troops quietly sailed upriver and climbed steep cliffs west of the city. By early morning, about 4,500 British soldiers had formed up on a flat area known as the Plains of Abraham, catching the French off guard. Montcalm, surprised by the sudden British presence, decided to attack quickly rather than wait for reinforcements. The French army advanced toward the British lines, but their formation was less organized. Wolfe instructed his troops to hold their fire until the enemy was very close. When the French came within range, the British unleashed a series of disciplined volleys that caused devastating damage. The battle itself lasted less than an hour but was extremely intense. Both commanders were mortally wounded. Wolfe died on the battlefield, while Montcalm died the next day. Despite these losses, the British gained the upper hand, and the French forces retreated back into Quebec. A few days later, Quebec surrendered to the British, marking a turning point in the war. The victory gave Britain control over much of New France and set the stage for the eventual British dominance in North America. The battle is especially significant because it reshaped the future of Canada. The British started calling 1759 the miracle year from their high military success. Despite British success, things didn't go well for their ally, Prussia. They suffered defeats at the Battle of Silesia in July at the hands of the Russians, and the surrender of an entire Prussian corps of 13,000 men to the Austrians. At the Battle of Maxen in November, they were highly damaging, but the biggest and most costly Prussian defeat of that year and one which nearly ended Frederick the Great's reign as king. On the 12th of August 50,000 Prussians met a combined Austrian-Russian army of 60,000 men, led by Ernst von Loden and Petrus Alikov. At the Battle of Overture both sides struggled in the difficult terrain, resulting in one of the bloodiest battles to be fought in Europe during that era. Upwards of 40,000 troops were killed or wounded, and the Prussian army collapsed into an undisciplined mess. Fortunately for Frederick, he was able to escape with some of his troops. There was some pickering, however, with Austria and Russia, so as a result, Russia refused to pursue the fleeing Prussians. It then fell to the Austrians after the victory at Kunersdorf. Despite the first half of 1760 bringing yet more defeats, with the Austrians winning the Battle of Landen in June, and the Swedes retaking parts of Pomerania, Frederick nevertheless managed to regroup his forces, and made a stand at the Battle of Liegnitz. Frederick nevertheless managed to regroup his forces, and made a stand at the Battle of Liegnitz. Laudon's Austrian cavalry attacked the Prussian position in the early morning but were beaten back by General Ziethen's hussars. An artillery duel emerged which was eventually won for the Prussians when a shell hit an Austrian powder wagon. The Austrian infantry then proceeded to attack the Prussian line, but was met with concentrated artillery fire. A Prussian infantry counterattack led by the regiment Anhalt-Bernburg on the left, forced the Austrians into retreat. At this point, every government was feeling the stress of maintaining the war. The 1760s, and onward saw a period of stalemate. Most were trying to find a way to establish peace, on the best terms. Except one country, Spain. Spain, for most of the conflict had been neutral, despite being ruled by the same house as France. However, and after Britain's major successes in North America, the Spanish fear that eventually the British would come after them and take their colonies, like Florida and Cuba. And that wouldn't be acceptable. The British eventually declared war on Spain, alongside Portugal, who was a British ally. There were free military campaigns across the world. First, a British expedition set sail for the Caribbean in March of 1762. They gathered other ships and troops in the West Indies, before launching an attack on the Spanish-controlled island of Cuba. In June, the British laid siege to Havana with some 30,000 men over a 10-week period. Before the city finally fell in mid-August, the British went to the Philippines, and laid siege to Manila, and early October the Spanish surrendered the Philippines to the British. Finally, both Spain and France launched the combined invasion of Portugal. Despite the immense strategic advantage, the Spanish army was repulsed by the combined British and Portuguese army, and just 10 months, Spain was defeated. The Russian captured the strategic port of Kolberg to receive supplies from sea. But then the Russian Empress Elizabeth would die. Her death was followed by the accession of Peter III, and then Catherine the Great in a quick succession. They were both born in German, meaning that they were more pro-Prussia. N. Peter, the Third Russia abandoned its ally Austria, joining forces with Prussia. With also, signing a peace treaty with Sweden, Frederick went on the offensive and recaptured much of the lost territory. The French realized the trouble that they were in. The British naval blockade of French ports, Russia now on the enemy team, and both Russia and Sweden's exit of the war. King Louis XV realized the war now wasn't winnable anymore. Negotiations would begin in Paris to put an end to the war. On February 10, 1763, the Treaty of Paris would be signed. The Spanish were forced to hand over Florida to the British. However, in exchange, the British gave back both the Philippines and Cuba to the Spanish. France, however, was punished for the war. They were forced to give up all of their colonies in India and North America. France was also forced to cede the Louisiana Territory, west of the Mississippi, to Spain in a secret 1762 agreement, finalized by the treaty. The French surrendered several others, including Tobago and St. Lucia, to Britain. However, they were able to keep Guadeloupe, Martinique, and the other colonies like Haiti. Britain came out of the war as probably the biggest superpower in the world at the point. They had conquered parts of India, and lots more of North America. But after the war, they were in big debt, a £60 million debt, which in today's US dollars would be $2.5 billion. They / were obviously broken and needed money back. However, they came to some weird conclusion. They had helped the colonies beat France and save them, and so, they thought it was their responsibility to help the British in return. In 1764, Britain introduced the Sugar Act, forcing a colonist to import sugar in the last exclusively from the British, and to pay duties on them. A year later, they would introduce the Stamp Act. The colonies didn't see this as fair, because they didn't have representation in the British Parliament. The one basically started this war, looked with envy, and he would become Britain's greatest enemy, and implement one of Britain's most humiliating defeats in all of human history.